The Reckless Bet. Charles Everly stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, the glass cool beneath his fingers as he gazed out over the sprawling cityscape below. The night was alive, a billion lights flickering like stars, illuminating the streets, the highways, the people below. To Charles, the view was a symbol of everything he had worked for, everything he had won. The penthouse, an extravagant testament to his success, was a fortress of solitude. With its sleek modern decor, polished wood floors, and walls adorned with abstract art, it was the perfect backdrop to the life he had built, a life where he never had to want for anything. Money flowed like water, power came easily, and every desire was met before it could fully form. At 32, Charles had conquered the business world. He had inherited a fortune, but unlike most heirs who squandered their wealth, Charles had turned it into something greater. He was a self-made millionaire, admired and respected in the circles he moved in. His luxury cars, expensive watches, and tailored suits had become a uniform, a daily affirmation of his achievements. But as the days stretched into weeks and the weeks into years, he began to feel the monotony creeping in. Nothing excited him anymore. The thrill of his first major deal had long since faded, replaced by an insatiable hunger for the next big thing, only to have it satisfy him for a fleeting moment. As he swirled the whiskey in his crystal glass, watching the amber liquid dance in the light, Charles wondered if this was all there was. He was rich, yes, but was he truly living? The city below him was teeming with life, but he felt disconnected from it, an observer in a world he could no longer connect to. He had everything anyone could ever dream of, but the emptiness that gnawed at him had begun to feel more real than all the things he had accumulated. A faint chuckle broke him from his thoughts. It was Rebecca Thompson, perched on one of the plush leather sofas in the center of his living room. She was the daughter of a shipping magnate, one of those people who had no sense of personal boundaries. She, too, was rich, and yet her life was filled with the kind of small-minded drama that Charles had long outgrown. "Charles, darling," she called, her voice oozing with a mix of flirtation and mockery. "Tell them about that time you made that real estate agent cry." Charles resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Rebecca had an uncanny ability to remind him of moments he preferred to forget. They were sitting in the middle of yet another celebration, another business deal gone smoothly, another set of problems solved effortlessly. His friends, gathered around the room, didn't seem to notice that this was all beginning to blur together. They were celebrating, but Charles couldn't even remember what they were celebrating anymore. A few handshakes, a couple of phone calls, a bit of paperwork, all in a day's work for Charles Everly. He looked at Rebecca, forced a smile, and stood up, walking toward her. "It wasn't much," he said, his voice carrying the usual aloof confidence. "She thought she could push me into paying more than the asking price for that property." Amateur move. The group erupted into laughter, a chorus of recognition at Charles' prowess. They didn't realize that his words were hollow, a carefully crafted performance for their entertainment. Beneath the surface, he was growing tired of their admiration, tired of their shallow jokes. He longed for something more, something real. But what could that be when everything around him felt like a game? Rebecca leaned forward, her eyes glittering with mischief. "I don't know, Charles. It just seems like you're too good at everything. Where's the challenge? Where's the excitement? At this point, you're just playing it safe." Charles paused. He had always prided himself on being able to master anything he set his mind to, but Rebecca's words stung. Was he really playing it safe? Had his success become a routine, something he could predict with his eyes closed? Maybe she had a point. The idea of a real challenge, something unpredictable, was starting to sound appealing. But the question remained, what could challenge him? Rebecca leaned back, a sly smile tugging at her lips. "I bet you couldn't even land a real challenge. Everything you do is too easy, Charles. It's all handed to you on a silver platter. I bet you wouldn't even know what to do with something truly difficult." Charles felt a flicker of irritation, but it was quickly replaced with determination. He was used to being underestimated. It had been that way for as long as he could remember. People assumed that his wealth had insulated him from the real world, that his life was nothing more than a smooth ride on a road paved with privilege. But what if he could prove them wrong? What if he could show Rebecca, and everyone else, that he wasn't just a lucky fool? "You think it's that easy?" Charles asked, his voice tight with resolve. "What do you want me to do? Take on some impossible task to prove myself?" Rebecca's smile widened. "Exactly. Why don't you try marrying someone from the streets? Someone who isn't impressed by your money or your title. Someone who's had to fight for every scrap they've ever gotten. Prove to me that you're more than just a trust fund baby. Make it work with someone who has nothing to offer you except a challenge." Charles stared at her, the absurdity of the idea slowly sinking in. Marry someone from the streets. Someone who had nothing. At first, the suggestion seemed laughable. Who would he even pick? He could have anyone. A model, a socialite, maybe even someone more refined, someone who could match him at his own game. But then, as he mulled it over, a thought crept into his mind. What if it wasn't about picking someone who could match him? What if it was about proving something, not just to Rebecca, but to himself? Could he really make a marriage work with someone so different from him? "All right," he said, his voice low but resolute. "You've got yourself a deal. I'll marry someone from the streets. I'll show you just how easy it is to turn any situation into a win." Rebecca's eyes gleamed. The challenge issued and accepted. "You're on, Charles. But there's one more thing." Charles raised an eyebrow. "What now?" "You can't just pick anyone, Charles," Rebecca said, her voice turning more serious. "You need someone who has nothing to offer you. Someone who won't care about your wealth, your power, your status. Someone who's been through the hard stuff. I want you to marry a janitor, Charles. Someone who's been working their whole life to survive. Someone who's used to fighting for every inch. No shortcuts." Charles didn't hesitate. "Fine. A janitor it is." Rebecca's grin widened. "Good. I can't wait to see how you handle it. But don't forget, the stakes are high. If you succeed, I'll double the stakes in that real estate deal we've been talking about. But if you fail, well, I guess you'll have to figure out what kind of man you really are." The words hung in the air as the group around them fell silent, the weight of the bet settling in. Charles felt a strange sense of excitement stirring inside him. This wasn't going to be like any other challenge. This was going to be something real. As Rebecca left his apartment, leaving behind the final, teasing words of their bet, Charles couldn't help but feel a mixture of confidence and doubt. He was used to winning. But this was different. He was stepping into unknown territory, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation. Little did he know, this reckless bet would lead him down a path that would change him in ways he could never have imagined. The unexpected challenge. The day after his bet with Rebecca, Charles couldn't shake the sense of unease that lingered in the pit of his stomach. He had made a rash promise, but deep down, he wasn't entirely sure what he was getting himself into. Marrying someone who had nothing, someone who lived a life of struggle and sacrifice. What did that even mean? The more he thought about it, the more absurd it seemed. How could anyone live that kind of life without being swallowed by bitterness, by resentment? How could someone like him, who had always had everything, possibly relate to that? But as much as he tried to dismiss it, the challenge gnawed at him. Charles was a man who thrived on proving others wrong, a man who had always been in control. This bet, however ridiculous, felt like an opportunity to show not just Rebecca, but everyone else, that he could win even in the most difficult situations. That afternoon, he drove through the city, the sound of his Lamborghini's engine roaring beneath him, but his mind was elsewhere. He had no idea where to begin. How was he supposed to find someone who fit the criteria? Someone who lived in obscurity, whose life was defined by hardship, who would be willing to marry him, the millionaire. He made his way to a part of the city he had only visited a few times before. It was a district he never cared to explore. Poor neighborhoods filled with aging buildings, cramped apartments, and the kind of grime that seeped into every corner. People hustled and bustled on the streets, their faces tired but resolute. There was a strange energy here, the kind of energy that came from survival, from living on the edge. Charles rolled down the window, letting the cool air rush in, but as the city's scent hit his nose, something inside him twisted. He didn't belong here. He didn't belong among these people. His thoughts were interrupted as he spotted a familiar face, a middle-aged woman sweeping the sidewalk near a corner store. She wore a faded yellow janitor's uniform, her face framed by graying hair that was tied in a neat bun. Her hands were rough, her back slightly bent from years of labor, but there was a quiet dignity in the way she worked. Eleanor. The name struck him, and for reasons he couldn't fully understand, he felt an odd pull toward her. It was like she had been waiting for him, an unexpected part of the puzzle he hadn't seen coming. Without fully realizing it, Charles found himself parking the car. He stepped out, adjusting his suit as he approached her. Eleanor glanced up at him, her tired eyes meeting his for the briefest moment before she returned to her work, unbothered by his presence. "Excuse me," Charles said, his voice smooth, though there was a hesitation in his tone that he couldn't mask. "I'm looking for someone." Eleanor didn't stop sweeping. "If you're looking for the owner, he's inside," she said without looking up. Her voice was calm, almost distant, as though she had grown used to the world ignoring her. "No," Charles said, pausing. "Not the owner. I was wondering if you could help me with something." Eleanor stopped sweeping, finally meeting his gaze. There was no fear, no hesitation in her eyes, only quiet curiosity. "I don't know you, and I don't know what you want, but I'm working." Her words were simple, and yet they held a quiet authority. "You're not from around here, are you?" Charles hesitated before answering. "No, I'm not. I was just wondering." He paused, unsure how to even phrase his thoughts. "Do you know anything about what it's like to struggle, to have to fight for every inch of life?" Eleanor studied him for a moment before answering. "I've lived it," she said simply. "I've fought for everything I have. And I've lost a lot too. It's part of life for people like me." Charles was taken aback. He had expected to hear bitterness, maybe even anger, but instead there was something different in her tone. Acceptance, strength. Eleanor spoke as though life had beaten her down, but she had never let it break her. And somehow, Charles felt small in comparison, despite his wealth, his suits, his accomplishments. In that moment, he realized that Eleanor had lived a life that he couldn't even begin to understand. "I'm not sure what you mean," Charles admitted. "I've had everything handed to me. I've never had to fight like you have." Eleanor gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You may have things, but don't think for a second that makes you stronger. Sometimes, having everything can make you weak, because you don't know what it's like to lose, to have to pick yourself up when life knocks you down." Charles was quiet for a moment, his mind racing. Her words hit him harder than he had expected. Here he was, standing in front of someone who had lived a life full of struggles, of small victories and large defeats, and yet she exuded more strength than anyone he knew in his world of luxury. "So," he said, his voice tinged with both nervousness and curiosity, "what if I told you I wanted to marry someone like you? Someone who's known hardship, someone who's had to survive in this world? What if I told you I was willing to prove that I could make it work, that I could rise to the challenge?" Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, but then she simply laughed, a dry, quiet laugh. "You're serious?" she asked, her voice almost mocking. "You want to marry someone like me? Someone who's spent her life cleaning up after people like you?" The question stung more than Charles wanted to admit, but he was committed now, and he would not back down. Not after everything that had been said, not after the challenge Rebecca had thrown his way. "Yes," he said firmly. "I do. I'll prove to you that I'm more than just the sum of my money. I'll prove that I can make it work, even if it's hard, even if it's different." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, considering him. The street noise, the hum of the city, seemed distant now, as though the world around them had faded into the background. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady, but with a hardness that surprised him. "You don't know what you're asking, son," she said. "This isn't some kind of game. This isn't a bet you can win with money or charm. People like me, we don't need your pity, your charity. If you're serious about this, you'll need to prove more than just that you can survive in my world. You'll have to show me that you can respect it. And that's something money can't buy." Charles swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He had thought he understood what he was getting into. But now, standing here, he realized just how little he knew. The game had changed. This wasn't about winning at all. It was about something deeper, something far more difficult than he had anticipated. "I'm ready," he said, his voice low but determined. "I'll prove myself." Eleanor studied him one last time before nodding slowly. "We'll see then. But don't think for a second that it's going to be easy." As she turned and resumed her work, Charles watched her for a long moment. The challenge was no longer just a bet. It was a test that would stretch him beyond what he ever thought he was capable of. And as he walked away, he couldn't help but wonder if he was prepared for the journey ahead. The condition. Days passed in a blur as Charles attempted to wrap his mind around the enormity of what he had committed to. What had started as a reckless bet with Rebecca was slowly turning into something much more complicated. The more he thought about Eleanor, the more he realized how little he actually understood about her world. She was no ordinary woman. No, she was someone whose life had shaped her in ways that Charles couldn't even begin to comprehend. Eleanor had made it clear that if he wanted to prove himself, it wouldn't be enough to just marry her. It wouldn't be enough to show that he could survive in a life far removed from the luxuries he was used to. He would need to respect her, respect everything she had built with her own hands. And that, Charles thought, was the real challenge. But it wasn't just Eleanor's life that Charles was struggling to understand. It was his own. He had been living in a bubble of privilege for so long that he had never truly considered the lives of those who didn't have the same advantages. Now he was expected to step into that world, to walk beside someone who had spent decades of her life fighting for every scrap. It felt like walking through a door he wasn't sure he was ready to open. The first few weeks of their interaction were a study in discomfort. Charles would visit Eleanor every day. Though it wasn't what he had imagined, he had expected some sort of glamorous romance, an exotic escape from the monotony of his life. But instead, he was thrust into the grind of her daily existence. He had underestimated what it meant to live like her. Eleanor worked long hours, often starting before the sun came up and finishing well after it had set. She cleaned offices, scrubbed floors in buildings that smelled of stale coffee and cigarette smoke, and emptied trash bins filled with discarded fast food wrappers and empty soda cans. But the work wasn't just physical, it was mental. She had to deal with the tired, dismissive stares of people who looked at her as though she were invisible, as though she didn't matter. Charles saw it every day. People in suits walking past her without even a glance, as though she were nothing more than part of the background. He could feel the weight of it, the subtle degradation in the air, and it unsettled him in ways he hadn't expected. He had always thought of himself as someone who understood people, someone who could read the room, assess the situation, and act accordingly. But with Eleanor, nothing was simple. She was a woman who demanded to be seen, not for what she could give, but for who she was. And that was something that Charles was slowly learning he had never truly understood before. It wasn't just the work that bothered him. It was the constant reminder of his own privilege. He had always viewed himself as a hard worker, but in comparison to Eleanor, he was a mere spectator in the game of life. He had been born with the kind of opportunities that most people could only dream of, and no matter how hard he worked, he couldn't change that. Eleanor, on the other hand, had built her life from the ground up, brick by brick, despite every obstacle life had thrown at her. It was humbling. One afternoon, as Charles sat in a modest diner near the building where Eleanor worked, sipping on coffee and waiting for her to finish her shift, he found himself thinking about the future. What would it look like for them to be together? What kind of marriage could they possibly have, given how different their lives had been? As he stared out the window, lost in thought, Eleanor walked in, her uniform slightly rumpled but her presence commanding. She spotted Charles immediately, and a flicker of recognition passed between them. But this time, there was something different in her eyes. She wasn't looking at him like she did before. She wasn't dismissive, but there was a certain distance, one that Charles hadn't felt before. "Charles," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day." Charles sat up straighter, his pulse quickening. He had been expecting this moment, the one where the reality of their situation would sink in. "What do you mean?" he asked, keeping his tone even. "About the bet," Eleanor began, her voice steady. "About proving yourself. I've been giving it some thought, and I think I need to make one thing clear." Charles felt a knot form in his stomach. Was this the moment when she would back out, when she would tell him that the whole thing had been a mistake? Eleanor took a deep breath. "I'm not going to make this easy for you, Charles. I can't. It's not in me to do that. You want to prove yourself to me. You want to marry me. Fine. But there's something you need to understand. I have my conditions, and you're going to have to meet them if you want to prove you're serious." Charles leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What kind of conditions?" Eleanor's gaze was unwavering as she looked him in the eyes. "First, you need to stop looking at me like I'm some charity case. You can't just come into my life and expect to sweep me off my feet with your money or your fancy words. I don't need that, and I don't want it. You want to be with me, Charles. You'll need to start seeing me for who I really am. No more pretending. I'm not some project for you to fix." Charles nodded slowly, taken aback by the directness of her words. He had always been the one in control, the one who set the terms of the relationship. But with Eleanor, everything felt different. She was challenging him in ways he hadn't expected. "And the second condition," she continued, her voice firm but calm. "If you're going to marry me, you need to understand that I won't be defined by you or your money. I've spent my whole life building something on my own. I won't be a trophy on your arm. I won't be the accessory to your wealth. If we're going to make this work, it has to be on my terms too." Charles absorbed her words, feeling the weight of them settle deep within him. This wasn't just about proving something to Rebecca or to anyone else. It was about proving something to Eleanor, and more importantly, to himself. He had never been asked to meet such conditions before, and the challenge of it stirred something within him. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'm not here to change you, Eleanor. I'm here to prove that I can change in ways that matter." Eleanor studied him for a moment, as though weighing his sincerity. Then, finally, she nodded. "Good. We'll see if you can live up to those words." For the first time since this whole challenge had begun, Charles felt a surge of hope, mixed with a deep sense of trepidation. He wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was clear. This was no longer about a bet. It was about something much more real, and it scared him. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't running away from fear. He was facing it head-on. As they sat in the diner, the world around them seemed to fade into the background. It was just the two of them now. Two people who had come from different worlds, but were slowly finding a way to build something in between. And as Charles looked at Eleanor, he couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something far greater than he had ever imagined. The struggle to adapt. The days following Eleanor's condition were more challenging than Charles had anticipated. He had believed that, with enough determination, he could adapt to her world. After all, he had overcome obstacles before, always with the help of his wealth, connections, and the sheer force of his will. But this was different. Eleanor wasn't just a woman to be won over with flashy dinners or extravagant gestures. She was a force of nature, grounded in a reality that he had only touched on the surface. Each morning, Charles woke up in his penthouse, surrounded by the trappings of his success, his crisp sheets, the view of the skyline, and the comfort of his expensive coffee machine. But now, there was something unsettling about it all. The contrast between his life and the life Eleanor led was starting to eat away at him. His world felt shallow in comparison to hers. The money, the luxury, none of it seemed to matter anymore when stacked against the quiet dignity Eleanor carried with her every day. Charles knew that to prove himself to her, he had to step out of his comfort zone. But that was easier said than done. He tried to visit her as much as he could during her shifts, but even that proved difficult. Her schedule was erratic, her time short, and when he did manage to catch her, she didn't have time for pleasantries or small talk. There was work to be done. It didn't take long for Charles to realize just how hard Eleanor worked, not just physically but mentally. She had no time for drama, no patience for pretense. If he wanted her to see him as someone worthy of her time, he would have to earn it, on her terms. One late evening, as he sat at a bar in his penthouse, nursing a drink, he couldn't help but feel frustrated. He had spent years cultivating an image of success, of control, but in the face of Eleanor's straightforward, no-nonsense attitude, he was floundering. It wasn't just her conditions that were difficult. It was the way she made him confront his own insecurities, his own weaknesses. She didn't admire him for his wealth or his status. She admired him for his willingness to be real with her, to stop pretending. But it wasn't easy. The following week, Charles decided to take a more proactive approach. He wanted to show Eleanor that he wasn't just passing through her world. He was immersing himself in it. He reached out to a contact of his who owned a chain of low-income housing properties. The plan was simple. Charles would spend a day doing manual labor. No one would know it was him. No one would recognize the young millionaire with a history of privilege and entitlement. It would be his way of showing Eleanor that he wasn't just playing a role. He was committed to her world. The day arrived, and Charles dressed in simple, worn clothing, a t-shirt, a pair of jeans, and old sneakers he had found in the back of his closet. He showed up at the building early in the morning, before the tenants started coming and going. His first task was to help clean the lobby, to sweep the floors, and wipe down the walls. He had imagined the work would be simple, almost beneath him, but he was wrong. The broom felt heavy in his hand. The dust and grime stuck to the floor in stubborn patches. The smell of mildew lingered in the air, and Charles fought back the urge to cough. His arms were sore by the end of the first hour, his hands raw from the effort. No one had warned him about how physically exhausting the work would be, but he pushed through. He had to. This wasn't just about cleaning a floor. It was about proving to Eleanor, and to himself, that he could do more than just live a life of privilege. He could survive in her world. By the time lunch came around, Charles was exhausted. His back ached, and his hands were blistered from the work. He had sweat dripping down his face, and for the first time in a long time, he felt vulnerable. But he kept going. As the day wore on, he moved from task to task, fixing broken fixtures, cleaning windows, even helping to carry boxes of supplies up the stairs. It wasn't until he was nearly finished for the day that he encountered a woman who had been watching him from a distance. She was older, perhaps in her late 40s, with a warm but weathered face. Her name was Clara, and she had lived in the building for over 15 years. She smiled at Charles, noticing his struggle with the broom. "Not easy, is it?" she said, her voice soft but knowing. Charles wiped his brow and nodded, unsure of what to say. "No, it's definitely harder than I expected." Clara chuckled. "People like you always think it's going to be easy, but it never is. You get used to the work, but it's always hard, and it's never ending. You can clean a floor, but it's dirty again by the next day. You can fix something, but it breaks again. That's the way it is for people like me." Her words hit Charles like a cold splash of water. He had always been used to results, his deals, his investments, his life, All of it had been a calculated pursuit of success. There had always been a clear end goal. But here, in this world, nothing ever seemed finished. Everything was temporary, fleeting. The work was endless, and the struggle was constant. "You know," Clara said, looking at him closely, "I don't know what your story is, but you're doing this for more than just the bet, aren't you? You're trying to prove something to someone." Charles hesitated, unsure of how much he should reveal. "Yeah, I guess you could say that." Clara nodded knowingly, her expression softening. "You'll learn something in this line of work, young man. You'll learn that you can't just change what's on the outside. You have to change what's on the inside too." Charles was quiet for a long time, taking in her words. It was the first time that anyone had spoken to him about the deeper layers of his life, about the things that couldn't be fixed with money, or power, or success. After finishing up the last of the work, Charles returned to his penthouse, his body sore and his mind heavy. He took a long shower, the hot water doing little to ease the tension in his muscles. But as he sat down to dinner, something had shifted inside him. He had come to this world thinking he could prove himself with his money, with his charm, with his ability to outwork everyone around him. But now, he realized, the real challenge wasn't just about surviving. It was about changing. It was about unlearning the things he had been taught his whole life, and replacing them with something more authentic. The next day, he visited Eleanor again. She was finishing up her shift, as usual, looking worn but steady. He approached her with the same nervous energy he had before, but this time, there was a quiet confidence in his eyes. "I did it," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I worked. I spent a whole day doing manual labor, just like you do. And I get it now. I understand how hard it is." Eleanor didn't immediately respond, but her eyes softened. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Good," she said. "You're starting to understand. But there's more to it than just working hard. You'll have to keep proving it, day after day." Charles nodded, a sense of determination filling him. "I will. I won't stop." And in that moment, he realized that the path he was on wasn't just about winning her heart. It was about transforming himself. And if he wanted to be worthy of Eleanor, he had a lot more work ahead of him. The tipping point. As the weeks went on, Charles became more deeply immersed in Eleanor's world. He woke up earlier, worked harder, and began to spend less time in his luxurious penthouse. The allure of designer suits and polished cars seemed to lose its grip on him. Instead, he found himself seeking out the simplicity of the world Eleanor had made for herself, one where each day felt like a new battle, and every victory was hard-earned. But it wasn't just the work that changed him. It was his growing realization that the life he had been living before wasn't enough. Charles had always believed that success meant more money, more power, more influence. But as he worked side by side with Eleanor, he realized how empty that philosophy felt. Here in this world, nothing was given. Everything had to be earned. Nothing was handed to you because of your name or the wealth in your bank account. People like Eleanor had to work twice as hard for a fraction of the opportunities he had taken for granted. She had something he had never fully understood before: resilience. Every evening after finishing his work with Eleanor, Charles would return home to his penthouse. But instead of his usual routine of lounging on the couch with a glass of wine, his mind would race. He spent hours in quiet contemplation, reflecting on the past few weeks. He had learned so much, but every lesson seemed to raise more questions. What did it mean to truly work for something? To truly earn it? It wasn't long before Charles realized something that shook him to his core. The life he had been living wasn't just about money. It was about the way he had distanced himself from real connection. He had built an empire, but that empire had been constructed on the backs of other people, people whose struggles he had never fully acknowledged. He had looked at the world as a place to take from, not a place to give. And now, standing beside Eleanor, he was seeing that the real value in life came from how much you could give, how much you could contribute to the lives of others, not how much you could accumulate. As the days passed, Charles' understanding of Eleanor deepened. He had started to admire her more than he ever thought possible. It wasn't just her ability to endure hardship, it was her ability to find joy in the small things. It was the way she never asked for pity or sympathy. Eleanor had survived a lifetime of struggle, but she wasn't defined by it. She was defined by her unwavering determination to keep moving forward, even when the world seemed determined to hold her back. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Charles found himself sitting next to Eleanor on a park bench, watching the sun dip below the horizon. She had finished her shift early, and they had decided to take a walk together, something he had come to enjoy. It wasn't a date per se. It was just two people who had started out worlds apart, sharing a quiet moment of peace. "You know," Charles began, breaking the silence, "I thought I understood what it meant to struggle, but I didn't know what it felt like to truly fight for something." Eleanor glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Most people don't, Charles. Not until they have to. Life doesn't give you much if you don't earn it." He nodded, his thoughts swirling. "I'm starting to understand that. I've spent my life thinking I could buy my way into anything. But now I see that what matters isn't what you can buy. It's what you can give." Eleanor turned toward him, her gaze piercing, as though she was weighing his words. "You're starting to see the bigger picture, but it's not just about giving. It's about sacrifice. Are you willing to make sacrifices for the people who matter to you? Are you willing to give up the life you've built in order to build something better?" Her question hit Charles like a ton of bricks. He hadn't thought about it that way before. Was he willing to give up everything he had in order to be the person Eleanor saw in him? The person she needed him to be? "I don't know," Charles admitted, "but I'm willing to try." Eleanor studied him for a long time before answering. "That's the first step." But as he stood up to leave, a wave of unease washed over him. He had been trying to prove something to Eleanor, but now he was beginning to wonder if it wasn't just about her. Was he ready to change for himself? Was he willing to let go of everything he had known and embrace the unknown? As the weeks continued to pass, Charles found himself making greater and greater sacrifices. He pulled away from the high-powered business deals he once relished in favor of spending more time at the community center where Eleanor volunteered. He helped with projects, organized fundraisers, and even started teaching young men and women how to manage finances, something he knew well, but had never considered sharing before. But no matter how hard he tried to immerse himself in Eleanor's world, there were moments when the weight of his past life came crashing back. He would see glimpses of his old friends, the ones who still lived in the same luxurious bubbles he had once inhabited, and he felt a pang of longing. They had all remained the same: shiny cars, expensive clothes, and connections that could open doors for them at a moment's notice. It was in these moments of doubt that Charles would turn to Eleanor, whom never asked for anything in return. She didn't need his money, his status, or his influence. She needed him to be there, to show up, to stand beside her through the daily grind. And little by little, Charles started to realize that this, more than anything, was what he had been searching for. It wasn't the riches or the luxury. It was the sense of purpose that came with knowing he was part of something greater than himself. One afternoon, while working at the community center, Charles received a call from his attorney. The news was startling. His business empire was facing a potential collapse. A series of bad investments, hidden debts, and shady dealings had left him in financial jeopardy. The comfortable life he had built, the life that had once seemed so invincible, was now at risk. At first, panic set in. How would he survive without his wealth? What would he do if he lost it all? He paced in the quiet office of the community center, trying to gather his thoughts. But then, like a calm before the storm, a quiet realization settled over him. For the first time in years, Charles didn't feel the overwhelming urge to fix everything. He didn't need to scramble to save his reputation or prove his worth to the world. Instead, he picked up the phone and called Eleanor. "Eleanor," he said, his voice trembling, "I need your help." She was silent for a moment before responding. "What's going on, Charles?" He explained everything: the debts, the investments, the mess that he had found himself in. But what surprised him the most was her reaction. Eleanor didn't offer sympathy, and she didn't make promises. She simply said, "I've been where you are. I know what it's like to lose everything. But that doesn't mean it's the end." Her words weren't filled with pity or concern. They were words of strength, words that reminded him that even in the face of collapse, you could still rebuild. It wasn't about what you lost. It was about what you could build from the ashes. And in that moment, Charles understood something that had eluded him his entire life. His worth didn't lie in his possessions or his wealth. It lay in his ability to rise up again and again when life knocked him down. And with that, something shifted inside Charles. He wasn't just changing for Eleanor anymore. He was changing for himself. The man he was becoming was no longer defined by his past. He was defined by what he was willing to do next. This was the tipping point, the true test. And no matter what happened next, Charles was ready to face it. A new beginning. The weeks following the financial crisis were a blur of frantic phone calls, late nights filled with spreadsheets, and endless meetings with his attorneys and business partners. Charles had never felt more vulnerable. His once unshakable empire was crumbling, and all he could do was try to salvage what was left. But no matter how hard he worked, it seemed as if every move he made only deepened the hole he was in. Yet, amid the chaos, Charles felt a sense of clarity he had never known before. He had been so focused on the external, on the money, the prestige, the power, that he had neglected the deeper truths of life. Now, with everything he thought defined him falling apart, he was forced to face the person he had become. He couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come since meeting Eleanor. The woman who had once been an object of his bet, a symbol of everything he thought he could control, had become his teacher, his mirror, and ultimately, his partner. For the first time in his life, Charles was beginning to see things differently. He realized that wealth, status, and luxury were fleeting. What mattered most were the relationships he had cultivated, the people he had impacted, and the way he had chosen to live. Eleanor had shown him that true success wasn't about accumulating more, but about living with integrity, humility, and purpose. Charles had spent years building a life that was polished and perfect on the outside, but now he could see that it lacked depth. Eleanor, with her quiet strength and unwavering commitment to the community, had taught him that the deepest form of wealth was found in the way you gave to others, in the way you stood by people when they needed you the most. But now, as his empire threatened to collapse, Charles faced the toughest question of all. Could he still find a way to hold on to his newfound values and face the consequences of his mistakes? Could he be the man Eleanor believed him to be, even when everything around him was falling apart? One evening, after another grueling day of meetings, Charles found himself at a crossroads. He sat alone in his penthouse, looking out at the city below, the very city that had once been his symbol of triumph. The lights twinkled like tiny stars, but now they felt distant and cold, a reminder of a world that no longer held the same allure for him. His phone buzzed with another notification, another investor pulling out, another creditor demanding repayment. But Charles didn't feel the usual wave of panic. Instead, he simply stared at the screen, wondering what he could possibly do to fix everything. As the silence of the room enveloped him, Charles realized something profound. He had been trying to fix his life with money, but he couldn't fix everything that way. It wasn't the money that defined him. It was how he faced his failures. It was how he chose to rise from the ashes and do the right thing, not just for himself, but for those around him. He picked up the phone and called Eleanor. Her voice, calm and steady as always, answered almost immediately. "Charles, what's wrong?" "I need to talk," he said, his voice heavy. "I've made a mess of everything, and I don't know how to fix it. But I know one thing. I want to change. I want to be the person you've shown me I can be." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Charles could almost hear her weighing his words, her sharp instincts reading between the lines. "You've made mistakes," she said softly, "but that doesn't define who you are. It's what you do now that matters." Charles closed his eyes, letting her words wash over him. "I don't know where to begin," he admitted. "You begin by doing what you've always been too afraid to do," she replied. "You own up to it. You face the consequences, and you make things right. Not for anyone else, but for yourself. Only then will you truly be free." Her words hit him hard. He had spent so long trying to hide from his failures, covering them up with quick fixes and temporary solutions. But now, for the first time, he realized that the only way forward was to face the truth head-on, no matter how painful it might be. That night, Charles sat down at his desk and began to make the difficult decisions. He called each of his major investors and explained the situation. No excuses, no hiding behind polished words. He was honest about the mistakes he had made and the measures he was taking to correct them. It wasn't easy, and many of the calls were tense, but Charles knew it was the only way to rebuild his integrity. As the days passed, Charles began to let go of the parts of his life that had once seemed so important: the deals, the contracts, the endless pursuit of more. He stopped fighting so hard to hold on to his wealth and instead focused on making the right choices, even if it meant losing everything he had worked so hard to build. But amidst the chaos, Charles found something else, something even more valuable than success or wealth. He found a sense of peace. As he continued to work on undoing the damage he had caused, Charles realized that Eleanor had been right all along. The real test of a person's character wasn't how they performed when everything was going well. It was how they responded when everything fell apart. And Charles was determined to rise to the challenge, not just for Eleanor, but for himself. Meanwhile, Eleanor continued to work tirelessly in the community, her life still grounded in service and resilience. Charles watched from a distance, seeing how she touched the lives of everyone around her. He admired her strength and grace, but he also saw the toll it took. She had sacrificed so much for the community, for the people she loved, and now it was his turn to do the same. Charles knew that he couldn't go back to the man he was before. He couldn't unlearn the lessons he had learned from Eleanor. No amount of money or status could ever fill the void he had once tried to fill with superficial success. What mattered now was how he chose to use his resources to help others, how he chose to be a part of the world in a way that was meaningful. One day, Charles visited Eleanor at the community center. It was the first time he had come to see her without any agenda, without any desire to impress her or win her favor. He simply wanted to be with her, to show her that he had truly changed. Eleanor greeted him with a smile, and for a moment, they just stood there, looking at each other. There was a quiet understanding between them, a bond that had been forged in the fire of their shared experiences. "You look different," Eleanor said after a moment. "You've changed." Charles smiled, a genuine smile this time, without the weight of pretense. "I have, and I'm still changing, but I'm not the man I was before." "I can see that," she said softly, her gaze searching his eyes. "But remember, Charles, it's not about perfection. It's about the effort, the willingness to keep trying, no matter how many times you fail." Charles nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and humility. He knew there was still much work to be done, but for the first time in his life, he felt that the path ahead was clear. He didn't need to fix everything overnight. He didn't need to be perfect. What mattered was his commitment to the journey, to the people who mattered, and to the life he was now building, piece by piece. As the sun set behind them, Charles took Eleanor's hand, a silent promise between them. They didn't need to speak to understand each other's hearts. The road ahead would be difficult, but it was a road he was finally ready to walk together.